Somewhere behind your own face, in the narrow space where jaw meets skull, there is a quiet trace of a shift that began long before anyone alive today was born. It lives in the gap between the size of a tooth and the size of the bone meant to hold it. A gap that opened once humans stopped following their food and started growing it instead. That change did not stay in the past. It carried forward into the shape of the face you carry right now. Why did farming permanently reshape the human face? Picture a wide plain under a flat white sky, long before any city stood anywhere on the earth, where a figure crouches beside a root pulled fresh from dry ground and lifts it, still gritty, toward a mouth that has never known anything softer than this. The jaw closes down slowly, meeting real resistance, muscle drawing tight along both sides of the face, the full row of teeth pressing together again and again until the tough fiber finally gives way. This was not a strange or difficult moment stitched into an otherwise easy life. It was closer to the ordinary rhythm of simply being alive, the quiet baseline against which nearly every human mouth on earth was once built and tested, day after day, for a length of time that reaches back to the very beginning of the human story. Long before farms, before villages, before anything that could be called a kitchen, eating was itself a kind of labour performed by the jaw. And the jaw, like any part of the body asked to work hard and often, answered that demand by growing into a shape suited to it. The food itself came in forms that asked a great deal of a mouth. Roots pulled from packed earth, wild greens tough with fibre, nuts and seeds that had to be cracked open before anything inside could be reached. Meat that had not been softened by any long process of preparation. All of it required sustained, repeated effort simply to be turned into something a body could use. There was no cutting board, no simmering pot, no method of preparation that could quietly do the jaw's work in advance. Whatever softening happened to a piece of food happened almost entirely inside the mouth itself, through grinding and tearing that could take far longer than a single bite might suggest. A single meal, stretched across an afternoon of gathering and chewing, could ask more of a jaw in an hour than an entire day of eating asks of most jaws now. This was the physical world into which a human child, for the greatest portion of the human story, was born. To understand why that mattered, it helps to sit for a moment with something true about bone in general, something that applies to a human skull just as much as it applies to a human leg. Bone is not fixed the way a stone is fixed. During the years when a body is still growing, bone tends to respond to the forces placed upon it, building itself outward and thickening itself in the very places where pressure is repeated and sustained. A limb used heavily for running tends to develop differently from one rarely used at all. A jaw asked, meal after meal, year after year through childhood, to grind tough roots, fibrous plants, and raw or lightly prepared meat tends to develop into a wider, longer, more heavily built structure than a jaw that is never asked to work that hard. This is not a special or unusual property of the mouth. It is simply how growing bone behaves everywhere in the body, and the jaw, sitting at the center of one of the most repeated physical acts a person performs across an entire lifetime, was shaped by this principle as much as any bone could be. Since the earliest members of the human lineage began walking upright across open ground, searching for food that had to be found, dug up, torn, or chewed rather than delivered already soft, the demands placed on the jaw were part of what it meant to grow up human at all. This process was not spread out evenly across a lifetime. Like many parts of the growing skeleton, the jaw appears to be most responsive to mechanical demand during childhood. While bone is still forming and the muscles that anchor to it are still pulling it toward the shape it will keep into adulthood, a jaw asked to work hard during those early years, through the exact stretch of life when a young mouth is first learning to manage tough food on its own, had the chance to grow outward and lengthen in ways that later effort, applied to an already mature bone, could not easily reproduce. Once that window closed, the shape of the jaw was largely set for the rest of a person's life. This is part of why the connection between early diet and adult jaw shape appears so consistently across skeletal evidence, and part of why a shift in what very young mouths were regularly asked to do could leave a mark that would carry forward for a lifetime, and eventually, across enough lifetimes, for a very long stretch of human history. What this produced, across an enormous stretch of time, was not a jaw straining to contain teeth it could barely hold. It was closer to the opposite. Researchers who study skeletal remains from populations that lived before farming took hold in their region have repeatedly noted something that stands out once it is pointed out. Dental arches that are wide, jaws that are robust, and teeth that sit with enough room to align cleanly against one another. Crowding, the kind familiar to so many people today, where teeth twist, overlap, or push against their neighbours for lack of space, appears far less often in these older remains. Wear patterns on the teeth themselves tell a consistent story too, a story of surfaces ground down steadily over years of heavy use, evidence not of damage but of a system doing exactly the work it had been built across a lifetime to do. None of this means every early human mouth was without flaw, and no single skeleton can stand in for every person who ever lived before agriculture. The way researchers reach these conclusions is itself worth pausing on, since it is not built from a single dramatic find, but from patient, repeated comparison. A skull pulled from a burial site can be measured for the width and depth of its dental arch, examined for the angle and evenness of wear across each tooth surface, and checked for the presence or absence of crowding at the front and back of the mouth. When researchers lay these measurements from one population against those from another, separated by thousands of years or by a change in how that population found its food, differences that would be invisible to a casual glance become impossible to ignore in the data. This kind of comparison has now been carried out at burial sites on more than one continent, among populations that never had contact with one another, and the direction of the pattern tends to repeat itself independently in place after place. That kind of independent repetition, showing up in unrelated populations separated by geography, is part of what gives researchers confidence that they are looking at a real biological pattern rather than a coincidence tied to one site or one group of people. Taken together, across many sites and many separate populations studied by many different researchers, a pattern emerges that is hard to dismiss as coincidence. For a very long stretch of the human timeline, going back to the point at which the modern human jaw first took roughly the form it holds today, the size of the jaw and the size of the teeth it carried appear to have matched each other closely enough that there was, in most cases, simply enough room. It is worth sitting inside that fact for a moment rather than rushing past it, because it is easy, from where things stand now, to assume that a crowded mouth or an impacted tooth is simply part of what it means to be human, a fixed cost of having this particular kind of skull. The evidence from those older populations suggests something different. It suggests that for the greater part of the time humans have existed as a species, the fit between jaw and teeth was not a source of routine trouble. It functioned, largely, the way a matched pair of components in any system tends to function when each part has been shaped by the same pressures over the same span of time. The jaw grew wide because it needed to be wide. The teeth arrived into a space built for them by exactly the kind of chewing they would eventually be asked to perform. There was no built-in mismatch waiting to surface later in life, no crowding treated as an unavoidable feature of growing up. This was, for an extraordinarily long portion of the human story, simply what a normal human mouth looked like and how it worked, generation after generation, without needing correction of any kind. And yet that same body of skeletal evidence, once it is followed forward through time rather than left sitting in the deep past, does not stay this way. At some point along that long timeline, in site after site, in one region and then another, the pattern researchers had grown used to seeing begins, gradually, to change. Jaws that had been wide and robust for so long start to appear narrower in more recent remains. Crowding, once rare enough to stand out as an exception, starts turning up with a frequency that cannot be explained by chance alone. Teeth that once had room begin, in skeleton after skeleton pulled from later layers of soil, to overlap, to twist, to press against one another in exactly the way that once was uncommon. Nothing about the human jaw itself was replaced in this period. No new bone, no new kind of tooth appeared to explain the shift. Whatever caused this change came from somewhere else, acting on a structure that had remained remarkably stable for a very long time before it started, in a comparatively short window of the human timeline, to look different than it had for that entire preceding stretch. It helps, before going further, to hold both ends of this timeline in mind at once. At one end sits the earliest human jaw, shaped generation after generation by a childhood spent working tough food with real effort, growing wide enough to hold a full set of teeth without complaint. At the other end sits a face recognizable today, carrying a jaw that, for a large share of people, no longer offers quite enough room for everything meant to fit inside it. Between those 2 points lies almost the entire span of human existence on one side, and a comparatively narrow slice of time on the other. And yet it is that narrow slice where the visible change concentrates. Nothing about the bone itself lost its ability to respond to demand. Nothing about the teeth grew larger or less suited to a human mouth. Whatever changed, changed the demand, not the machinery built to answer it. What could reach into a system that had worked so consistently for so long and begin to pull it out of alignment without changing the bone or the teeth themselves at all? The plane under the flat white sky, the root pulled fresh from dry ground, the jaw straining against real resistance meal after meal, all of that had shaped a mouth built for a particular kind of demand across an entire childhood spent growing. Somewhere past that point in the story, the demand itself must have started to change, quietly enough that no single generation would have noticed it happening, and thoroughly enough that its trace is still visible in the shape of a face today. No single skull holds the full answer to what that change was, and no single sight can explain why a pattern this old would begin to bend. What the evidence offers instead is a boundary, a line somewhere on the timeline before which the old fit reliably held and after which it reliably did not, and a face carried by billions of people now on the far side of that line, still shaped by an answer none of them chose, and most of them never think to ask about. Picture a small, cleared patch of ground, the wild plain from before pushed back at its edges, where someone kneels beside a shallow stone bowl and works a handful of grain against its surface with a second stone, back and forth, until what began as hard little seeds becomes a rough, pale powder. Nearby, over a low fire, water and that same powder are already turning into something thick and soft, something that will need almost no work from a mouth at all beyond a few slow movements and a swallow. This scene would have been unthinkable across almost the entire span of the human story that came before it, and yet, at a certain point, in more than one part of the world, independently and without any of those places knowing what the others were doing, people began to live this way. They began to choose which plants would grow where, to plant seeds on purpose rather than only gather what happened to be growing, to return to the same patch of ground season after season instead of moving on. This choice, made separately in different regions at different points along the human timeline, marks one of the largest shifts in how humans obtained food since the human lineage first began finding its own way of eating in the first place. It did not stop at the plants themselves. A person who plants and tends a crop cannot simply walk away from it the way a person gathering wild food might walk on to the next stand of roots or the next herd of animals. Staying close to a field through an entire growing season meant staying in one place, building something more permanent than a temporary camp, gathering a small group of people around the same patch of cleared ground year after year. Storage followed almost immediately behind cultivation, since a harvest gathered all at once had to last through months when nothing new could be grown, and so grain pits, baskets, and simple granaries began appearing beside these settled homes, holding food that no longer needed to be found fresh each day. All of this, the settling down, the storing, the returning to the same ground, formed the wider environment inside which the small stone bowl and the low fire made sense, an environment that had no real equivalent anywhere earlier in the human story. What changed first was not the human body. It was the world immediately in front of it, the food itself, sitting on a stone or in a bowl waiting to be eaten. Where the earlier diet had leaned on roots, wild greens, nuts and meat, all of it fibrous, all of it demanding real mechanical effort, the new diet leaned increasingly on cultivated grains, wheat and barley in one region, rice in another, maize in another still, each one a small hard seed with almost nothing to offer a person until it had been broken down first. That breaking down did not happen in the mouth the way it once had. It happened before the mouth ever became involved, through grinding between stones, through soaking, through long, slow cooking over fire that turned something hard into something that barely required chewing at all. A meal that had once meant an hour of steady, deliberate grinding work for the jaw could now mean a bowl of warm, soft grain eaten in a fraction of that time, with a fraction of that effort. The process behind that bowl was itself new. Grinding grain between two stones, one held in the hand and drawn across a larger flat stone set on the ground, was slow, repetitive work. But it was work done by the hands and the back rather than the teeth, shifting the labour of preparing food away from the mouth and onto tools and technique instead. Once ground, that grain could be mixed with water and left to cook slowly over a fire that had, by this point in the human story, already been part of life for an extremely long time, though never before called on to transform food quite this thoroughly. Heat broke down the tough structure of the seed further still, turning something that had started out hard enough to crack a tooth into a substance closer to paste. A person eating from that pot needed only to bring it to the mouth and swallow. The jaw called upon mainly to manage temperature and pace rather than to grind anything into a swallowable state at all. This was not a small adjustment to how people ate. It was closer to a full reversal of what a normal meal asked of the body, arriving after a stretch of the human story, reaching back to the very beginning of that story, in which the opposite had reliably been true. There was also something new in how often this softer food could be reached for. In the world before farming, easy, low-effort food existed here and there, a piece of ripe fruit, a bit of marrow already loosened from a bone, but it came and went with the season and the luck of what happened to be found that day. It was never something a person could count on meal after meal, day after day, for months at a stretch. A stored granary beside a settled home changed that entirely. Grain kept dry and protected could be pulled out and ground whenever it was needed, regardless of season, regardless of what the surrounding land happened to be offering that week. For the first time since the earliest ancestors of this species had begun eating the tough, resistant food that shaped the human jaw in the first place, soft, low-effort food was no longer an occasional stroke of luck. It was something closer to a standing option, available on an ordinary day in a way it had never reliably been before. It is worth being precise about what farming actually introduced, since it is easy to picture it simply as more food arriving more reliably, and to leave it there. What it introduced, at least as much, was a different relationship between food and the effort needed to eat it. Grain, once it had been ground and cooked, could be swallowed with barely any resistance at all, spooned or scooped rather than torn and worked. Bread, once ovens and hearths made it possible, offered something soft enough that even a person with a compromised or underused jaw could eat enough of it to survive comfortably. Porridge and gruel, common across many early farming societies in one form or another, could be fed to very young children and older adults alike without asking either group to do the kind of grinding work that had once been unavoidable. A person recovering from illness, a person with teeth already worn down by decades of harder eating, a person simply tired at the end of a long day of work in the field, all of them now had access to food that placed almost no demand on the jaw at all, something that would have been far harder to come by, and far less common as a daily option in the world before farming. None of this made people weaker as individuals, and none of it should be read as any kind of failure. It simply meant that for the first time across the long human timeline, a person could eat a completely adequate, filling, nourishing meal every single day of an entire life, while asking almost nothing physically demanding of the jaw to do it. That last point deserves to sit for a moment, because it marks a genuine turning point, rather than a gradual drift. For nearly the whole of the time humans have existed, going back to the earliest ancestors who first relied on tough, resistant food to survive, the jaw had never been offered a way out of hard work. Even when meat was plentiful, even when a particular season brought an unusually easy harvest of nuts or fruit, the baseline diet still required real, sustained effort from a young mouth learning to manage it. That baseline had held, largely unbroken, across every stretch of the human story that came before this one, passed from one generation to the next, not as a rule anyone wrote down, but simply as the only way eating had ever worked. Farming, once it took hold in a region, changed that baseline itself. It did not simply add new foods to an existing pattern. It offered, for perhaps the first time in the story of this species, a way of eating that could be sustained, generation after generation, without requiring the jaw to do anywhere near the work it had consistently done before. Whatever this new way of eating meant for the body, It did not arrive as a single dramatic event witnessed by one generation. It settled in slowly, region by region, as farming itself spread and took root, until in place after place, the diet that had shaped the human jaw for so long was simply no longer the diet that most people, most days, actually ate. It would be tempting, at this point, to treat the story as finished, to say simply that softer food arrived and the jaw, no longer asked to work as hard, quietly grew smaller in response. The way a muscle left unused might soften over time. Something in that direction does appear to be part of what happened, but the full picture resists being folded into something quite that tidy. Farming did not arrive at the same moment everywhere, nor in exactly the same form, nor with exactly the same foods, and the pattern of change in the jaw does not always line up perfectly, region by region, with the pattern of when farming itself arrived in that same region. In some places, the two seem to move together closely, a settled farming population showing narrower jaws and more crowding within a relatively short span of adopting agriculture. In others, the timing is less exact, with changes in jaw shape appearing more gradually, or lagging behind the earliest signs of cultivation by a stretch of time that is hard to explain through diet alone. Some researchers studying this question have also raised the possibility that movement of people between regions and the mixing of populations that had developed somewhat differently shaped jaws and teeth over long separate histories may have contributed to crowding in certain places as well, layered on top of whatever effect diet itself was having. None of this undoes the basic pattern connecting softer food to a jaw asked to do less work. It simply means the honest version of this story has more than one thread running through it at once, several forces converging on the same structure across a similar stretch of time rather than one single cause acting entirely alone. A change in what people ate is clearly part of what reshaped the human face. Whether it is the entire cause, acting alone, or one force among a small number of forces working together on the same structure at roughly the same period, is a question the evidence has not yet been asked to fully settle, and it is one worth carrying forward rather than answering too quickly here. The plain from before, the tough root pulled from dry ground, the jaw built across a childhood of real resistance, all of it stands on one side of this shift. On the other side sits a bowl of soft grain, ground and cooked, until it asks almost nothing of the mouth at all, and a body that would spend the rest of the human story learning to live inside the space between those two very different worlds. Picture a table under a bright, even light, where a researcher lifts a skull carefully from a padded tray, turning it so a gloved finger can trace the curve of the lower jaw from one side to the other, pausing where the teeth still sit close together in their sockets, some slightly turned, one pressed against its neighbour in a way that leaves almost no gap between them. Nothing about this skull explains itself on its own. It only begins to mean something once it is set beside another skull, pulled from a different layer of the same ground or a different site altogether, one whose jaw is wider, whose teeth sit with room to spare. This kind of comparison, skull against skull, site against site, region against region, is how the story of the human jaw has actually been pieced together, not from a single dramatic discovery, but from the same patient method used again and again across the world, always returning to the same starting point, buried in that comparison, the deep stretch of the human timeline when the jaw and the teeth it carried were still shaped by the demands described earlier in this story. The work itself is slow in a way that rarely makes it into a single striking image. A researcher might spend years working through boxes of remains from a single burial ground, measuring the width of each jaw at several fixed points, noting the angle at which molars meet, recording whether a canine tooth had room to sit flush against its neighbours, or was forced to twist and overlap for lack of space. Multiply that work across dozens of individuals from a single site, then across dozens of sites separated by distance and time, and a picture begins to take shape that no single skull on its own could ever offer, a picture built entirely from repetition and comparison, rather than from any one dramatic find. None of this work depends on assuming what the answer will be before the measuring begins. A researcher recording the width of a jaw or the angle of a molar is simply recording a number, And it is only once thousands of these numbers are gathered from thousands of individuals across many separate sites that any pattern becomes visible at all, the same way no single grain of sand reveals the shape of a dune, though the whole dune is made of nothing else. What makes this evidence unusually convincing is something easy to miss at first. Farming was not invented once, in one place, and then carried everywhere else by people who had already worked it out. It was invented separately more than once, by populations that had no contact with one another, and no way of knowing that people an ocean or a continent away were arriving at a similar idea using entirely different plants. In the region often called the Near East, early farmers built their lives around wheat and barley, learning across generations how to select seed, how to store a harvest through a dry season, how to grind and cook grain into the kind of soft daily food described earlier in this story. In parts of East Asia, separate populations were doing something similar with rice and millet, developing their own tools, their own methods of preparing grain, their own rhythms of planting and harvest tied to entirely different rivers and seasons, without any connection to what was happening farther west. Rice in particular, once boiled, becomes soft enough to require almost no grinding work from a jaw at all, a texture arrived at through a completely separate tradition of food preparation built from the ground up in that part of the world. In parts of the Americas, still another population, disconnected from both of those, built an entire way of life around maize, a crop unrelated to either wheat or rice, prepared using its own distinct techniques passed down through generations in that region alone, techniques that in some traditions involved treating the kernels before grinding in ways that made the resulting food easier to digest and easier to eat. Each of these transitions amounts to something close to a separate, independent test of the same underlying question, run by people who never spoke to one another, working with different crops, different climates, and different traditions, arriving at farming through paths that shared almost nothing except the basic decision to grow food rather than only gather it. When researchers compare skeletal remains from before and after these separate transitions, region by region, a pattern begins to surface that would be far less convincing if it had only appeared once. In sites associated with early wheat and barley farming, remains from populations that had shifted to this new grain-based diet tend to show narrower jaws and more crowded teeth than remains from populations in the same general region who had not yet made that shift. A difference visible in the same measurements a researcher might take on any two skulls, arch width, tooth alignment, the amount of space left at the back of the jaw for the last molars to fully emerge. In sites associated with early rice and millet farming, on the other side of the world, entirely unconnected to the wheat and barley story, a broadly similar pattern turns up in the comparison between pre-farming and farming era remains, despite the fact that the crop itself, the preparation method, and the surrounding culture had nothing in common with what was happening in the Near East. It is worth pausing here to remember how far back the shared starting point for all of these comparisons actually reaches, back past any of these three regions, back to the point when a single ancestral pattern of jaw growth, shaped by the demands of raw and fibrous food, was still common to every human population on Earth before any of them had begun farming at all. In regions where maize became the foundation of the diet, a similar direction of change appears once more, even though maize was typically prepared using its own separate techniques, often softened and treated in ways that made it especially easy to eat without much chewing at all. Three unconnected populations, three unrelated staple crops, three separate and independent paths into farming, and in each case, once researchers set the earlier skeletal remains beside the later ones, a similar shift toward narrower jaws and tighter dental crowding shows up in the comparison. It is worth sitting with why that repetition matters as much as it does. A single site showing this pattern could always be explained away as coincidence, as something specific to that particular population, that particular burial ground, that particular stretch of preserved bone. Perhaps that one group had unusual genetics, or an unusual local disease, or some other narrow explanation that would not apply anywhere else. Three separate populations, unconnected by trade, migration, or shared knowledge, arriving at farming through entirely different crops and showing a similar shift in jaw and tooth alignment once they did, is much harder to wave off as chance. This is close to what researchers mean when they describe something as being tested by natural experiment, rather than by a single observation. Nobody designed this comparison in advance. History simply ran the same basic transition 3 separate times, in 3 separate corners of the world, using 3 different plants, and in each case left behind a version of the same skeletal signature for later researchers to find and compare. When 3 unrelated experiments, run without any coordination and separated by oceans, land on a similar result, the odds that this result reflects something real about how the human jaw responds to a changed diet grow considerably stronger than they would from any one case alone. The picture is not, however, perfectly uniform once it is looked at closely, and honesty about that unevenness matters more than smoothing it away for the sake of a cleaner story. In some of these regions, the shift toward narrower jaws and crowded teeth appears fairly soon after the archaeological evidence for farming itself becomes clear, the 2 changes tracking each other closely enough that a fairly direct connection seems reasonable. In other regions, the skeletal shift appears more gradually, spread across a longer stretch of time than the adoption of farming itself, as though the body took longer to show the full effect of a diet that had already changed. It is worth imagining what that gradual version of the shift would actually look like inside a single community living through it, generation after generation, eating a diet that had already changed, while carrying jaws still shaped by an older pattern, until slowly, almost without any one generation noticing, the skeletal record of that community begins to bend in the same direction seen elsewhere in the world. In at least a few cases, researchers have noted the skeletal pattern lagging behind the earliest clear evidence of cultivation by a span of time wide enough to raise real questions about what else might have been happening during that gap, questions that diet alone does not fully answer. None of this weakens the larger pattern connecting farming to a change in the human jaw. It does mean that pattern is not a single simple switch flipped the moment the first seed was planted, and that whatever is happening inside the body to produce this shift may depend on more than just what a population happened to be eating in any given year. That gap, the space between when a population's diet clearly changed and when its skeletons clearly show the effect, is where the story now needs to go next. There is something almost humbling in how long this kind of question can sit unresolved even with a large body of careful measurement behind it. 3 continents, 3 unrelated crops, and a broadly consistent direction of change are enough to establish that something real connects farming to the shape of the human jaw, but establishing that a connection exists is not the same as fully explaining how it works, and researchers working on this question have generally been careful not to claim more certainty than the skeletal record actually supports. Diet explains a great deal of what the comparison between these 3 independent regions reveals, but it does not, on its own, explain why the timing sometimes lines up closely and sometimes does not, nor does it fully explain what is actually happening inside a growing jaw to produce a narrower shape in the first place, beyond the general sense that less mechanical work seems to leave less of an impression on growing bone. Somewhere underneath these 3 separate archaeological stories lies the same quiet biological process first described back at the very beginning of this account, the process by which a young jaw, still forming, answers whatever demand is placed on it during childhood. Diet decides what that demand will be. Something else, still not fully accounted for here, decides how directly and how quickly the growing body actually answers it, which is part of why the same underlying shift can leave its mark quickly in one region and only gradually, sometimes generations later, in another. The skull on the table, and the ones beside it from 3 unrelated corners of the world, all point toward the same broad conclusion, without yet answering the more specific question underneath it, the question of exactly how a change in food, sometimes arriving quickly and sometimes taking generations to fully register, reaches into a child's growing skeleton and leaves behind the particular shape of a jaw that a person will carry for the rest of their life. Somewhere beneath the skin of a child's growing face, in a place no eye could ever observe directly while it is happening, a muscle used every day for chewing pulls, again and again, against the place where it anchors to bone, and the bone answers that pull the only way growing bone knows how to answer anything, by adding a little more of itself exactly where the strain keeps landing. Nothing about this process announces itself. No single day of a childhood would ever reveal, on its own, that anything was being decided at all, and yet across enough ordinary days, strung together one after another without any single one of them standing out, an entire shape is being quietly assembled. This is not a single event with a beginning and an end. It is closer to a conversation carried on in a language made of tension and response, repeated at every meal, across every year of childhood, between a muscle doing its ordinary work and a bone deciding, almost cell by cell, how much of itself is actually needed to keep up with the demand being placed on it. Biologists studying growth describe something close to this using the idea of a functional matrix. The notion that a bone does not simply grow according to some fixed internal blueprint on its own, but grows substantially in response to the soft tissue working around it and against it. Muscle, tendon, the repeated motion of a jaw closing down on food day after day through the years when that jaw is still capable of changing shape at all. This idea reframes something that might otherwise sound strange. The claim that a bone as solid and permanent seeming as a jaw is, for a meaningful stretch of childhood, still listening to the muscles around it and adjusting itself accordingly. A bone is not inert the way a piece of stone is inert. Living bone tissue is constantly being broken down in some places and rebuilt in others across an entire lifetime, though this process is at its most active and most responsive during the years a body is still growing, when the balance between building and breaking down tips clearly toward growth, and tips especially strongly toward growth, in exactly the locations where mechanical strain keeps landing. The muscles most responsible for this particular conversation sit along the sides of the face and deep within the jaw itself, anchoring the lower jaw to the skull and drawing it upward and forward with each bite. These are the same muscles, doing largely the same work, that were shaping the wide, robust jaws described earlier in this account, long before farming ever entered the picture, back when a mouth had no choice but to work hard at nearly every meal, from the earliest years of life onward. A diet that demands real, sustained grinding asks these muscles to work hard, repeatedly, across an entire childhood, and muscles asked to work hard tend, like most tissue in a growing body, to grow larger and stronger in response. In much the same way, a limb used heavily for a particular kind of movement tends to develop differently from a limb rarely called upon at all. A larger, stronger muscle then pulls with more force at the exact points where it attaches to bone, and the bone at those attachment points, especially while a child is still growing, responds to that increased force by adding material, by lengthening, by widening exactly where the strain is greatest. This creates something closer to a loop than a single straight line of cause and effect. Tough food building stronger muscle placing greater strain on bone, greater strain prompting more growth creating more room for teeth to arrive into later, each step feeding the next across years rather than days. What matters just as much as this basic mechanism is the fact that it does not behave like a switch with only two positions. A jaw is not simply told to grow wide or told to grow narrow depending on whether food happens to be hard or soft on any given day. The evidence instead points towards something closer to a threshold, a level of repeated, sustained mechanical strain that has to be crossed consistently across a meaningful stretch of a child's growing years before the bone responds with a real and lasting change in its shape. A single tough meal changes nothing. An occasional piece of dried meat or a handful of hard nuts eaten now and then, inside an otherwise soft daily diet, likely falls short of the sustained demand needed to shift how a jaw grows over time. What seems to matter most is the ordinary, unremarkable baseline of what a child eats on a completely typical day, repeated across hundreds and then thousands of days, since it is that steady baseline, far more than any single exceptional meal, that determines whether the muscles pulling on a growing jaw are working near the upper edge of their capacity or comfortably below it. This helps explain why a household that still occasionally serves something tough to chew, alongside a diet built mostly around soft grain, would not necessarily produce children with jaws as wide as those from a household eating tough food as its genuine daily baseline, since it is the baseline itself, not the occasional exception sitting on top of it, that the growing jaw appears to be responding to most strongly. It also helps explain why researchers comparing skeletal remains tend to look for broad population-level patterns rather than expecting every single individual within a farming community to show the exact same degree of change. Since small differences in an individual child's actual daily diet, easy to imagine but almost impossible to reconstruct precisely from bone alone this many years later, would be expected to produce some amount of natural variation even within a single generation living through the same broad historical shift. This threshold idea helps explain something that might otherwise seem strange: the fact that a population can shift its diet in a single generation and yet not see its skeletal record shift at the same pace. An adult who grew up eating the older, tougher diet already has a jaw shaped by that earlier demand, largely finished and settled by the time that adult reaches full maturity, since the growing years when a jaw remains genuinely responsive to mechanical strain sit almost entirely within childhood, not adulthood. That same adult can switch, later in life, to eating almost nothing but soft grain and porridge, and their jaw, already grown, will not meaningfully narrow in response, because the window during which bone answers this particular kind of demand has already closed for them personally. It is worth picturing this concretely: an adult who spent their own childhood on the older diet, jaw already wide and set, now sitting beside their own child at a meal built almost entirely around ground grain, the parent's mouth carrying one shape into this new world and the child's mouth about to be built into another, without either of them having any way to notice the difference forming between them. Their children, however, are a different matter entirely. A child born into a household that has already shifted to a grain-based diet, and who grows up eating that softer food as an ordinary daily baseline from infancy onward, passes through the entire window of jaw growth. Under conditions the muscles pulling on that jaw were never asked to work, especially hard to meet. It is that child's skeleton, not the parent's, where the full effect of the new diet would be expected to show up clearly for the first time. Seen this way, the timing gaps noticed in the skeletal record start to make a different kind of sense. A population does not shift its jaw shape the moment farming arrives, because the adults who first adopt farming are, in terms of their own jaws, already finished growing, carrying into the rest of their lives a shape set by whatever they ate as children before any of this began. The full skeletal signature of a changed diet only becomes visible once an entire generation has been born, raised, and grown to adulthood entirely within the new dietary pattern, having passed through its own window of childhood growth under conditions meaningfully softer than the conditions that shaped its parents. Depending on how quickly a community's daily diet actually changed, how consistently the new soft foods replaced the old tough ones at every meal rather than only some meals, and how many years separated one generation's childhood from the next. This lag could stretch across a single generation in some places and several in others, without requiring any explanation beyond the ordinary, well-understood biology of how a growing jaw responds to mechanical demand over time. In places where the archaeological record showed the skeletal shift tracking closely behind the arrival of farming, this same reasoning would suggest that the new diet was likely adopted quickly and thoroughly, reaching young children as a genuine daily baseline almost as soon as the crop itself became available, leaving very little gap between the arrival of soft food and its full expression in the next generation's bones. In places where the lag stretched longer, the same reasoning points toward a slower, more uneven adoption, perhaps tough foraged foods remaining part of a child's diet alongside the new grain for longer than in other regions, delaying the moment a generation's jaws were shaped by soft food alone rather than by some ongoing mixture of the old world and the new one. None of this claims to be the entire explanation on its own, and it should not be read as though a single mechanism now accounts for every detail noticed in the archaeological comparison described earlier. It offers something more modest and, in its own way, more solid, a biologically grounded reason why diet and jaw shape do not have to move in perfect lockstep, even when diet is genuinely driving the change, and a reason why the specific stretch of childhood during which a young body is eating, chewing, and growing deserves close attention in its own right, since it is that stretch, more than any other period of a person's life, where the shape of an adult face is quietly being decided one ordinary meal at a time. This also raises a question that has so far only been touched on in passing: the question of what a child's earliest years of eating actually look like inside a farming household. well before that child was old enough to sit at a table and eat the same meal as everyone else. A newborn does not begin life on porridge and bread by accident, and the age at which a young child moves from milk to solid food, and the texture of whatever solid food it first receives, would sit close to the very center of this entire mechanism, since it is precisely those earliest years, before memory even begins, where the growing jaw is at its most responsive, and where the smallest differences in daily diet may leave the deepest and most lasting mark on the shape of a face that will still be recognizable, generations later, in a bowl of soft grain and a mouth built to receive it without complaint. Picture a woman sitting just inside the doorway of a mud brick home, a small child balanced against her hip, working a spoon of something soft and pale toward a mouth that has barely learned to manage solid food at all. The child swallows without much effort, barely pausing between one mouthful and the next, the whole exchange taking only a few unhurried minutes before the bowl is set aside. Somewhere nearby, a fire holds the last warmth from having cooked that same grain into softness an hour earlier, and the tools that made this moment possible, a stone bowl, a grinding stone, a pot capable of holding heat evenly, sit close by, unremarkable, already part of the ordinary furniture of this particular kind of life. A generation earlier, in the same family line, a very similar scene would have looked noticeably different. A caregiver working food with their own mouth first rather than a stone, a texture left rougher, a child's jaw meeting slightly more resistance at roughly the same age. Nothing about this moment would have struck anyone living through it as significant. It was simply how a very young child was fed on an ordinary afternoon, repeated with only small variation across countless afternoons just like it, in countless homes built along the same general pattern, across generations that had no way of knowing they were part of anything larger than their own immediate lives. And yet, according to everything laid out so far in this account, it is exactly this kind of unremarkable moment, repeated day after day across the earliest years of a life, before any memory of it could ever be formed, that carries the greatest weight of all in deciding how a jaw will eventually take shape. If mechanical demand during childhood is what tells a growing bone how much of itself is needed, then the very beginning of that childhood, the period stretching from a first taste of anything beyond milk through the years, when a child is still learning to manage solid food independently, deserves to be looked at directly rather than treated as background detail. Long before farming, the period during which a human infant moved from milk toward the ordinary adult diet appears, from what evidence survives, to have stretched across a meaningful length of early childhood rather than happening quickly or all at once, and the food introduced during that stretch was rarely soft in the way it often is today. This fits naturally with everything already described about the world such a child was born into, a world where the tough root, the fibrous plant, the raw or lightly prepared meat, stood as the ordinary baseline of every meal, with nothing resembling a jar of soft, storable, easily prepared food sitting nearby for a caregiver to reach for on a difficult day. In many traditional societies studied by anthropologists, caregivers have been observed softening food for a very young child, not by cooking it into a paste, but by chewing it themselves first, and passing it, already partly broken down, to the child, a practice that still exists in parts of the world today, and likely has deep roots reaching back across a large stretch of the human story, since it requires no tools, no fire, no preparation beyond a caregiver's own mouth, and would have made sense as a solution across almost any stretch of the deep human past. Even food handled this way retained more texture, more residual toughness, than a food that had been ground between stones and simmered into porridge, and a child eating this way across an early childhood spent gradually moving toward tougher foods appears to have received real, if modest, mechanical demand on the jaw considerably earlier than a soft grain-based diet would typically allow. The transition from milk to full participation in an adult diet, under these conditions, looks less like a single decisive moment and more like a slow climb, one texture at a time, spread across years rather than compressed into months. Farming changed this picture in a way that reaches back to some of the very same evidence already described in this account, though drawn from a different kind of clue preserved in bone and teeth. Researchers studying ancient diets have found ways to read chemical traces left behind in bone and in the layers of a growing tooth that can indicate roughly when a child stopped relying primarily on milk and moved toward eating solid food alongside or instead of it. A nursing infant carries a distinct chemical signature in its tissue, inherited in part from relying on its mother's milk rather than on food taken directly from the surrounding world, and that signature shifts gradually as solid food takes on a larger share of what a child actually eats. Because teeth form in layers, somewhat like the rings inside a tree, a single tooth can preserve a rough timeline of this shift, laid down early in life and then left essentially untouched for the rest of that person's existence, available for a researcher, many centuries later, to read back out again. When these methods are applied to remains from populations before and after the shift to farming, a pattern consistent with everything already discussed here tends to appear. Populations relying heavily on soft cultivated grain show signs of introducing solid food and increasing its role in a child's diet, along a somewhat different course than populations relying on the older, tougher forage diet, with softer supplementary food available to be offered earlier and more heavily once grain had become a reliable part of daily life. None of this points to one single fixed age shared by every population everywhere, and the chemical traces involved are read with real caution by the researchers who study them, since bone and tooth chemistry can be influenced by more than diet alone, including illness, individual variation, and the particular conditions of preservation at a given site. Two children from the same population, even the same household, would not necessarily show identical timelines once their remains were examined this closely, and researchers working with this kind of evidence tend to speak in terms of broad tendencies across many individuals rather than precise ages that could be assigned with confidence to any one child. What the pattern does suggest, cautiously and without overstating the certainty involved, is that the earliest, most formative stretch of a child's eating life looked meaningfully different once grain-based farming took hold, at precisely the period when, according to the mechanism described earlier in this account, a growing jaw is most responsive to exactly this kind of difference. What makes this early window worth returning to so deliberately is how directly it compounds across generations once it takes hold. A single child weaned earlier onto softer food grows into an adult whose own jaw carries a slightly different shape than a parent who spent those same early years on tougher food. But that adult, once grown, becomes a caregiver in turn, likely offering a very similar diet to their own children, since a caregiver tends to feed a child using methods learned from their own upbringing, adjusted only slightly by whatever new foods or tools have become available in the meantime. Across 2, 3, 4 generations, each one repeating a broadly similar early diet to the one it grew up on itself, whatever small effect a single generation's shift towards softer early food produced would not simply appear once and then level off. It would have the chance to compound, layered on top of a starting point already narrower than the one before, a pattern that fits naturally with the archaeological picture described earlier of change accumulating gradually rather than snapping into place all at once. No single generation would have needed to notice anything unusual happening in order for this compounding to proceed exactly as it did, since each set of caregivers, in every generation along the way, would only have been doing what looked to them like ordinary, unremarkable feeding of an ordinary child. There is a further layer to this same shift worth sitting with, one that reaches beyond any single child's jaw and into the size of the population itself. Anthropologists studying the demographic side of the transition to farming have repeatedly noted that many early farming populations appear to have grown in number more quickly than populations still relying on foraging, a difference visible in the relative number of burials, in the density of settlement sites, and in other indirect measures researchers have learned to read from the archaeological record. One plausible contributor researchers have pointed to, among several, is exactly the kind of soft, storable, easily prepared food described throughout this account. Among many foraging populations studied by anthropologists, an extended period of nursing has been linked to a natural spacing between births, since the demands nursing places on a mother's body can, in many cases, delay the return of fertility until that nursing eases or ends. A caregiver able to offer a young child soft grain porridge, available reliably regardless of season, may have been able to wean that child from milk somewhat sooner than would otherwise have been comfortable or safe, and an earlier weaning has been linked, in various studied populations, to a shorter interval before another pregnancy could follow. If that connection holds even partially true, then the same bowl of soft grain responsible for the changing shape of the human jaw may also sit somewhere near the roots of a separate and much larger story. The story of human populations beginning to grow at a pace unlike anything seen across the long stretch of time before farming existed at all. This does not mean every aspect of that population growth traces back to weaning food alone, since farming brought many other changes at the same time. Changes in settlement, in food storage, in exposure to new illnesses living close to animals and to each other, all of which researchers weigh together rather than crediting to any single cause. But it does mean the small bowl balanced on a caregiver's lap, and the soft spoonful being offered to a child too young to remember any of it, may have been doing quiet work on two entirely different scales at once, reshaping one growing face while contributing, in some small measure, to reshaping the size of an entire population across the generations that followed. What remains is to bring this back down to a single mouth, a single set of teeth arriving, one after another, into a jaw that early diet has already spent years shaping before the first tooth in question ever appears, and to ask what happens when a jaw built along these newer, narrower lines is finally asked to make room for every tooth it was designed further back in the human story to hold. Every thread followed so far in this account, the diet that changed, the archaeological record that traced that change across 3 separate continents, the biological mechanism translating mechanical demand into bone growth, and now the earliest years of childhood where that mechanism first begins its work, all converge toward the same narrow point in a person's life, the years just before and during which a full adult set of teeth attempts to settle into a jaw whose final dimensions were determined long before any of those teeth had even begun to form. There is a place far back along the row of teeth on either side of the mouth, past the point most people ever think to pay attention to, where the very last tooth in the entire human set is meant to arrive. It does not come in early, the way a front tooth does, announcing itself in early childhood. It waits, sometimes for well over a decade, sometimes closer to 2, before it finally attempts to push up through the gum and settle into whatever space happens to be left for it by that point. For a great many people alive today, that space is simply not there in the way it once was, and the tooth arrives to find a jaw already full, every other position already claimed, nowhere left to go but sideways, or backward, or nowhere at all, sitting sealed beneath the gum for the rest of a person's life, never fully emerging. Somewhere behind that quiet tightness, felt by so many people as nothing more than an occasional dull pressure or a passing ache at the very back of the jaw, sits the entire chain of events already traced across this account, a chain that began not with a single tooth or a single person, but with a change in food that took hold long before any currently living person's family line could trace itself back to it, passed down quietly through bone and childhood diet across more generations than anyone could easily count. This is the tooth commonly called a wisdom tooth, and of every tooth in the human mouth, it is this one, arriving last, asked to fit into whatever room happens to be left over after every other tooth has already taken its place, that carries the clearest and most personal trace of everything described so far in this account. To understand why this particular tooth sits at the center of the story rather than any other, it helps to think about the order in which a human mouth actually fills itself in across a lifetime. The front teeth, the ones used for biting into food directly, tend to arrive first, early in childhood, while the jaw still has a great deal of growing left to do, claiming the portion of the jaw that will have the most time and the most subsequent growth still ahead of it to accommodate whatever final size that region eventually settles into. The teeth used for grinding, moving backward along the jaw, tend to arrive later, spaced out across childhood and into adolescence, each one claiming a position the jaw has, by that point, generally grown enough to accommodate, since the jaw itself, as described earlier in this account, is still actively lengthening and widening in response to mechanical demand throughout these same years. The very last of these, the third molar, sitting furthest back of all, typically does not attempt to arrive until a person is well into their teenage years or beyond, by which point the jaw has, for the most part, already finished the bulk of its growing, its overall length essentially locked in place by everything that has already happened to it across the preceding 15 or so years of chewing, eating, and mechanical demand. Whatever length that jaw ended up with, shaped across all the years and mechanisms described earlier in this account, is essentially the length available to this final tooth when its turn finally comes. There is no second chance for the jaw to grow further to make room. The space is either there, left over after every earlier tooth has settled into its own position, or it is not. Every earlier tooth in the sequence, arriving in its own turn across childhood and adolescence, has, in effect, already placed its claim on the jaw's available length well before this final tooth ever gets its chance, meaning the last tooth in line inherits whatever remains after every other claim has already been settled with no ability to negotiate for more. This is precisely why the wisdom tooth functions almost like a marker for something much larger than itself. A jaw that grew wide. The way jaws are described earlier in this account as having grown across nearly the entire span of the human story before farming, tended to leave enough room at the very back for this last tooth to settle in without much difficulty, arriving into a space built across an entire childhood of real mechanical demand to be large enough for a complete adult set of teeth. This matches closely with what was described earlier about the skeletons pulled from sites older than farming itself, jaws wide enough, arches long enough, that crowding of any kind, anywhere along the row of teeth, showed up far less often than it does in remains from farming populations and from people living today. A jaw that grew along the narrower lines shaped by a softer, farming-era childhood diet, described across the last several parts of this account, often does not leave quite enough of that same room, and the last tooth to arrive is the first, and often the only, one to run out of space entirely, since every tooth ahead of it in the sequence had already claimed its portion of whatever length the jaw had managed to grow. Researchers studying skeletal remains from populations before farming have repeatedly found this particular tooth sitting in its expected position with relatively little difficulty, aligned and functional, the same way the earlier teeth in the same jaw tend to be. In many populations studied from after the shift to farming, and especially in populations living under modern conditions today, this same tooth turns up impacted, unable to emerge properly, sitting at an angle or pressing against the tooth in front of it, in a share of individuals large enough that dental professionals today treat this as an entirely ordinary, expected part of a great many people's adult lives, rather than as anything unusual. The specific ways this particular tooth ends up positioned, when the space behind it runs short, follow a fairly consistent set of patterns that dental researchers have documented across a great many cases. Sometimes the tooth tips forward, angled into the tooth just ahead of it rather than standing upright the way earlier teeth typically do, caught at the exact angle the available space happened to allow as it tried to push through. Sometimes it tips the opposite way, angled backward toward the rear of the jaw, or sideways, lying nearly flat beneath the gum rather than upright at all. Sometimes there is simply not enough vertical room either, and the tooth stops part way, visible on an X-ray but never breaking through the gum at all, remaining exactly where it stalled for the rest of a person's life, unless something is done about it. None of these outcomes reflects anything unusual about an individual tooth itself, which is generally formed correctly and would very likely have settled into place without incident in a jaw with a bit more length behind it. What differs is simply the amount of room available at the moment this particular tooth's turn finally came, the last variable in a very long chain, arriving after every other factor described across this account had already, quietly, finished doing its work, long before this particular tooth ever had any say in the matter at all. It is worth pausing on how directly personal this particular thread becomes, compared to nearly everything discussed earlier in this account. The diet of a farming household several thousand years ago, the timing of weaning in a population long since gone, the exact regional pace of an ancient agricultural transition, these are all matters that can be examined at a comfortable historical distance, interesting in the way any distant history can be interesting, without necessarily touching anything in a listener's own present life. A tooth arriving into a mouth that does not have room for it is not a distant historical fact. It is something many people carry directly in their own bodies, right now, whether or not they have ever thought about where that particular tightness actually came from. For some, this shows up as nothing more than a faint occasional awareness that something sits differently far back in the jaw than everything in front of it. For others, it surfaces more directly, a tooth visible only at an angle on an X-ray, still sealed beneath the gum, or a tooth that partially emerged and then stopped, catching against its neighbour in a way that never quite resolves on its own. For still others, there is no noticeable sign at all, the tooth settling into whatever space happened to be available without ever announcing itself as a problem in daily life. A reminder that the amount of room left behind by this whole historical process varies considerably from one individual mouth to the next, shaped by countless small differences in ancestry, diet, and simple chance layered on top of everything already described in this account. The same chain of cause and effect traced across this entire account, food that changed, a mechanism inside growing bone that responded to that change, an early childhood window in which the response was set, compounding gradually across generation after generation, arrives, at the very end of that chain, at this exact spot, far back in an individual mouth, where a single tooth either finds room or does not. None of this is offered as any kind of judgment about an individual body, and none of it should be read as a statement about anyone's health in particular, since a great many factors beyond this one long historical thread can influence how any single person's teeth and jaw actually turn out. What the pattern does offer is a way of understanding why this particular kind of crowding became so common, so quickly, in evolutionary terms, without requiring any recent or unusual explanation at all. It is, in a real sense, an old story finally reaching its most exposed point, the last link in a chain that began with a change in what people ate, running quietly through bone, through childhood, through generation after generation, until it reached the last tooth in line, the one tooth in the entire human mouth that never had a second chance to find the room it needed. And yet a tooth arriving without enough room is unlikely to be the only place in the body where a narrower jaw eventually leaves some trace. The jaw does not exist in isolation from everything around it, sitting as it does at the front of a much larger structure that includes the space behind the mouth and down into the throat, a space every person relies on for something far more constant and far less optional than chewing ever was. If a change in childhood diet was capable of reaching all the way into where a single molar finally settles or fails to settle, the more open question, left for later in this account, is how far that same reach might extend beyond the mouth altogether, into structures a person spends far more of each day depending on without ever thinking about them at all. Behind the mouth, past the point where a wisdom tooth either finds room or does not, the body does not divide itself into separate, unconnected compartments the way it might be easy to imagine, no matter how convenient that kind of division might be for describing one structure at a time. The roof of the mouth is, at the same time, the floor of the space above it, the nasal cavity. The passage air moves through on its way down into the throat and the lungs. A single sheet of bone and tissue curved and shaped across childhood in much the same way the jaw itself was shaped, serves both functions at once, holding the tongue and the teeth below while forming the base of the breathing passage above. This is not a separate structure bolted on beside the jaw. It is the same architecture, continuous, built during the same years of childhood growth already described across this account, by the same general biological process of bone, responding to the forces and demands placed upon it while it is still capable of changing shape at all. A person running a tongue along the roof of their own mouth right now, tracing the curve from the back teeth up toward the front, is tracing, without necessarily realizing it, the underside of a structure that also happens to form the base of a completely different system, one built for breathing rather than eating, sharing the same bone and the same childhood history as everything already described about the jaw itself. That curve, high or flat, narrow or broad, was not decided at birth and left unchanged from that point forward. Like the jaw beneath it, the palate continues developing across childhood, responsive across those same years to many of the same surrounding forces, before eventually settling, sometime around adolescence, into roughly the shape it will keep for the rest of a person's life. Because of this shared architecture, a question naturally follows from everything already traced in this account, a question researchers in more than one field have begun asking directly. If a childhood diet softer than the one that shaped the human jaw for most of the species' history can leave that jaw narrower than it once tended to be, could the same softer childhood, working through the same shared bone, also leave the space above the jaw, the floor of the nose, the width of the palate arching overhead, narrower as well? This question reaches back to the very same starting point as everything else in this account, the wide, well-provisioned jaws described in skeletal remains from before farming, since those same populations, by the logic being explored here, would also be expected to show correspondingly broader palates and correspondingly more generous nasal and airway dimensions, built by the same childhood mechanism working across more than one structure at once rather than the jaw alone. A narrow, high-arched palate, rather than a broader, flatter one, is a pattern some researchers studying facial growth have associated with reduced overall dimensions in the nasal passage and in the airway space further back, toward the throat, in at least some individuals studied this way. The reasoning follows the same logic already laid out for the jaw itself: less mechanical demand during the growing years, less material added in response, a structure that ends up smaller across more than one of its dimensions rather than only the one most easily seen, since the palate and the jaw are, developmentally speaking, closely related structures rather than two entirely separate projects being carried out side by side in the same growing skull. There is a reason this kind of connection makes sense to researchers even before any single study manages to prove it conclusively, a reason rooted in how a face actually grows rather than in any single measurement. A developing skull does not build its different regions in isolation from one another, one project finishing before the next begins. The bones of the face, including the upper jaw, the palate, and the walls of the nasal cavity, grow together, influenced by many of the same surrounding muscles and by much of the same overall pattern of childhood development, in a way that makes it genuinely difficult, on biological grounds, for one of these regions to change substantially, while the others remain entirely untouched. Anatomists sometimes describe the growing face as a single interconnected unit, rather than a set of separate parts assembled side by side, precisely because so many of its structures share the same underlying bone, the same blood supply, and the same surrounding muscles across the years they are all developing together. This is part of why the same childhood described earlier in this account, the same tough root, the same years of real mechanical demand, would be expected, at least in principle, to leave its mark across more than one structure in the growing face, rather than confining itself neatly to the jaw and nowhere else. Whether that expectation holds up as firmly in careful measurement as it does in this general reasoning is exactly the open question researchers are still working through. It is important to be direct about how much less settled this particular thread is compared to nearly everything else covered so far in this account. The connection between ancient diet and the width of the jaw and the resulting crowding of teeth, including the wisdom tooth, rests on a large and fairly consistent body of skeletal evidence gathered from multiple unconnected regions of the world, evidence that has been examined and re-examined for decades, producing a level of agreement among researchers that is fairly unusual for a question about deep human history. The connection between jaw and palate width on one hand, and airway space or breathing on the other, is a genuinely active and still developing area of research, studied by orthodontists, by researchers in sleep medicine, and by evolutionary biologists, without anything like the same level of settled agreement. Part of the difficulty is that airway space is far harder to measure in ancient remains than jaw width or tooth crowding, since the soft tissue that lines the airway, the tissue that actually narrows or widens the passage air travels through, does not survive in a skeleton the way bone does, leaving researchers to reconstruct likely airway dimensions from bony landmarks alone, rather than measuring the airway directly the way they can measure a jaw. Where jaw width and tooth crowding can be measured directly from thousands of individual skeletons spanning many thousands of years, airway measurements in this kind of research usually rely on modern living populations, examined with imaging technology, unavailable to anyone studying remains from the deep past, which means the ancient half of this particular comparison, so solid everywhere else in this account, is considerably harder to establish with the same degree of confidence here. Airway space in any individual depends on a great many factors working together: the surrounding soft tissue, overall body composition, the position and size of the tongue, muscle tone, and simple individual variation, not on the shape of the jaw and palate alone. Researchers actively working on this question are, by and large, careful to describe jaw and palate shape as one contributing factor among several rather than as a determining cause on its own. And different studies looking at this question have not always reached identical conclusions, which is itself a normal and expected part of how a genuinely open scientific question looks, while it is still being worked out. Quite unlike the comparatively settled picture already established for jaw width and tooth crowding earlier in this account, none of this is intended, or should be read, as a comment on any individual person's breathing, sleep, or health in any specific way. This account has no way of knowing anything about any single listener's own anatomy, and nothing in this evolving area of research amounts to a diagnosis, a warning, or advice of any kind about what any particular person should do. A great many people carry a narrower palate or a more crowded jaw than their distant ancestors likely did, and experience no noticeable difficulty with breathing or sleep at all, since the body tends to be remarkably capable of adapting around small structural differences across a lifetime, and airway space, as already described, depends on far more than the shape of bone alone. Genetics pass down through a family line, the particular climate and altitude a person grows up in, general patterns of health during childhood, and simple individual variation from one skull to the next all layer on top of whatever influence childhood diet may or may not be contributing, making it very difficult to look at any single person and attribute anything specific about their breathing to this one historical thread alone. What it does offer, held at the appropriate distance and with the appropriate caution, is one more illustration of how far a single historical shift in childhood diet may be capable of reaching through a body that, from the outside, looks like nothing more than a face. The same shared bone that holds the teeth also helps shape the floor of the breathing passage above them, and if one of those two structures shows a clear and well-documented historical change, it would hardly be surprising, though it remains only partially proven, if researchers eventually found the other showing some version of the same pattern once the tools available for measuring soft tissue in ancient remains catch up to the tools already available for measuring bone. Stepping back from this particular question, still open and still being investigated, it is worth noticing how far this account has already travelled from where it began. A single bite into a tough, resistant root on an open plain, through a change in food, through bone, through childhood, through crowded teeth, and now to the edge of a question about breath itself. A question this account is not in a position to close, only to note honestly as one of the furthest and least certain branches of a story that, at its centre, remains solidly supported by a very large body of skeletal evidence gathered across the entire world. What began as a story about a single kind of tooth running out of room has, followed far enough, turned into a story about how tightly connected the different parts of a growing face actually are, connected closely enough that a change in one corner of childhood, something as ordinary as the texture of a daily meal, appears capable of leaving its trace across a surprising range of structures, some of them well documented and firmly established, others still sitting at the edge of what current research methods are able to confirm. Somewhere between the well-proven and the still uncertain lies the honest shape of where this particular thread of the story currently stands, neither dismissed nor overstated, simply carried forward as one more branch off the same central trunk that began with a single change in what people, long ago, chose to grow and eat instead of gather. Picture a kitchen counter under electric light, a small jar with a twist top sitting open beside a spoon, its contents pureed down to something with almost no texture left at all, smoother even than the grain porridge described earlier in this account, smoother than anything a stone and a low fire could have produced on their own. A child sits nearby, already fed several spoonfuls, swallowing each one with barely a pause, the entire process finished in a few minutes without a single moment, requiring anything close to real chewing. Nearby, a refrigerator hums quietly, holding more of the same, rows of identical jars and packets, each one manufactured somewhere far from this kitchen, in a facility built specifically to produce food this consistent, this convenient, and this easy to eat, at a scale no single household could ever manage on its own, feeding not one child in one home but countless children across countless homes from the very same production line. This jar did not appear out of nowhere. It sits at the far end of a very long line, stretching all the way back to the ground grain, and the low fire described earlier in this account, the same basic impulse. Food prepared to require less effort from the mouth, carried forward across thousands of years and refined, at every step along the way, a little further than the step before it. The refining did not stop, once grain itself became a normal part of the human diet. Milling technology kept improving across the centuries that followed, and each improvement tended to move in the same direction, stripping away more of the tougher outer layers of a grain, leaving behind flour that was finer, whiter, and softer than what earlier generations of farmers had access to. This is worth setting directly beside the earliest scene in this entire account, the tough root pulled from dry ground, the jaw straining against real resistance meal after meal. Between that opening scene and the jar sitting open on a kitchen counter today lies not one single change, but a long, gradually accelerating sequence of them, each one making a meal a little easier for the mouth to manage than the meal before it, stretched across a period of time far longer than the centuries usually studied by anyone looking specifically at industrial food. A continuity easy to miss, precisely because each individual step along the way looked, to the people living through it, like nothing more than a small, sensible improvement. A loaf made from coarsely ground whole-grain flour still asks a jaw to do real work, resistant crust, dense crumb, fibre still largely intact. A loaf made from finely milled, heavily refined flour asks for almost nothing at all, closer in texture to the porridge that first replaced tough roots and raw meat than to anything requiring sustained grinding. This shift did not happen all at once either. It moved gradually across generations, much like farming itself once did, each improvement in milling technology reaching a slightly wider population than the improvement before it, until, within the last century or two, finely processed grain products became not an occasional luxury, but an ordinary daily food for an enormous share of the world's population. Alongside this refinement of grain itself came an entirely new category of food that had no real equivalent anywhere earlier in this account. Food engineered specifically for ease of preparation, long shelf life, and effortless eating, purees, soft breads, packaged snacks built from ingredients processed well beyond anything a stone grinder or a simple cooking fire could achieve. Where early farming softened food mainly through grinding and cooking, modern food processing adds mechanical shredding, chemical breakdown, and industrial techniques capable of reducing almost any ingredient down to something requiring next to no chewing at all. A piece of fruit, tough enough on its own to demand real biting and tearing, can now be turned into a smooth pouch. A child squeezes directly into their mouth without engaging the jaw in anything resembling its historical role. A cut of meat, once requiring sustained work from the jaw even after cooking, can now be finely processed into something soft enough to eat with a spoon, its fibers broken down by machinery long before it ever reaches a plate. Even foods that look, from the outside, much like their older counterparts, a piece of bread, a bowl of cereal, a soft cheese, are frequently manufactured using processes designed specifically to reduce the effort needed to eat them, since ease of eating has become, across the modern food industry, something actively engineered for rather than a side effect of simple preparation. A package on a store shelf rarely announces this quality directly, yet softness, alongside shelf life and consistent flavor, sits among the properties food manufacturers have spent considerable effort optimizing for across the past century, a goal that, whatever its intention, points in exactly the same direction as the shift traced across every earlier part of this account. This represents something genuinely new layered on top of everything already described in this account, not simply more of the same softening that began with early grain, but a further, considerably steeper drop in the everyday mechanical demand placed on a growing mouth. Researchers studying this more recent period of human history have found a way to test whether this continued softening actually continues to affect the jaw the same way earlier softening once did, by comparing populations that still eat a more traditional, minimally processed diet against closely related populations, sometimes drawn from the very same country or even the same extended family lines, who have shifted toward a heavily processed, industrial diet within living memory. This kind of comparison offers something the deep archaeological record cannot: populations separated not by thousands of years but by a single generation or two, sharing much of the same genetic background, differing mainly in what kind of food actually reached a child's mouth during the years that jaw was still growing. Because these groups share so much of their genetic history, differences that show up between them are much harder to attribute to anything other than the environment each group actually grew up eating in, which makes this kind of comparison, despite its much shorter timescale, unusually clear as a test of the same basic mechanism traced across the rest of this account. Studies built around this kind of comparison have repeatedly found meaningfully more dental crowding, narrower jaws, and less room for teeth, including the last molars, among the more recently industrialized groups than among their close relatives still eating the older, tougher diet, a difference appearing within a single lifetime rather than across the many centuries the earlier agricultural transition required to leave its mark. Some of this research has focused specifically on communities that shifted, within a generation or two, from a diet built around whole, minimally processed foods to one built around refined flour, packaged goods, and softer prepared meals, precisely the kind of comparison that isolates food texture as the variable most likely responsible for the difference observed. It is worth being careful, as with every comparison offered across this account, about what this kind of research can and cannot establish on its own. A single generation or two is a short window even by the standards of ordinary family history, and factors beyond food texture, general nutrition, overall health, dental care, and simple differences in how researchers happen to select and measure each group studied can all influence a comparison like this to some degree. Researchers working in this area tend to treat food texture as one clearly implicated factor among what is likely a small set of contributing influences consistent with the same cautious, threshold-based picture described earlier in this account, rather than as a single, all-explaining cause working in isolation. Even with that caution built in, the direction and consistency of what has been found across multiple separate studies of this kind, comparing traditional and industrialized diets within closely related populations, lines up closely enough with everything already established about mechanical demand and jaw growth that it would be difficult to dismiss as coincidence. What this suggests is that the story traced across this entire account did not conclude thousands of years ago with the original shift into farming. It appears to still be unfolding, quietly, in recent and even current generations, driven by the same basic mechanism described earlier, a jaw responding to the amount of mechanical work asked of it during childhood, only now responding to a level of softness considerably more extreme than anything early farming ever managed to produce. A grandparent, a parent, and a child within the very same family, born only a few decades apart, could in principle carry jaws shaped by three meaningfully different points along this same long continuum, the oldest closer to the tougher end of what farming once offered, perhaps raised on a diet still built around whole grains and food prepared largely by hand, the youngest closer to the softest food industrial processing has ever made available, raised from infancy on purees, refined flour, and packaged meals engineered for ease rather than resistance. This is worth holding alongside everything traced earlier about the pace of the original agricultural shift, which required generations, sometimes many generations, before its full effect became visible in a population's bones. The industrial shift in food texture, by comparison, appears in some of this research to be leaving a measurable trace within a single generation or two, a pace this account has not encountered anywhere else across its entire timeline, from the earliest tough root all the way through the long, slow spread of farming itself. None of this suggests any single generation did anything wrong in choosing convenient, safe, reliably available food for its children, and none of it is meant to single out any particular food, product, or parenting choice as responsible on its own. Modern food processing has also made nutrition more consistent and more widely available to more people than at almost any other point in this account's long timeline, a genuine benefit sitting alongside whatever effect texture alone may be having on a growing jaw. What this account can say, cautiously, and based on the pattern of evidence gathered so far, is that whatever has been driving the human jaw to grow narrower since the earliest days of farming has not run out of room to continue, and may, if anything, be moving faster now than at any earlier point across this entire long account, a trajectory set in motion by a single change in food thousands of years ago and still, quietly, working itself out in kitchens very much like the one described at the beginning of this account. Imagine, for a moment, a single modern face, entirely ordinary, belonging to no one in particular, examined the way a researcher trained in every method described so far in this account might examine it, not as one simple observation, but as a surface holding several separate signatures at once, each one arrived at through a completely different route, each one pointing in the same direction. Run a hand along the jaw and its width can be compared against measurements taken from skeletons pulled out of the ground on 3 separate continents. Look inside the mouth and the crowding of the teeth, if any is present, echoes a pattern first noticed by researchers measuring dental arches from populations that lived before farming and after it. Trace the roof of the mouth and its curve connects, however cautiously, to ongoing research into the space behind it, the space every breath depends on. Consider the very back of that same jaw, the spot where a wisdom tooth either settled comfortably or never fully emerged at all, and a single small detail carries within it an entire history of childhood diet, reaching back further than any single family could trace on its own. Nothing about this face would need to be unusual in any way for all of this to be true of it. It could belong to a person passing on any street in any city, someone who has never once thought about the shape of their own jaw as anything other than simply the shape it happens to be, unaware that a researcher equipped with the right training could read, in that same ordinary face, traces of a decision made by distant ancestors who never imagined anyone would still be carrying the consequences of it this many generations later. None of these observations exist in isolation. They are instead different windows looking into the same single history, each one built from its own separate body of evidence, its own separate researchers, its own separate methods, and each one arriving, independently, at a broadly consistent picture of what happened to the human face once farming, and everything that followed it changed what a growing child's mouth was actually asked to do. It is worth pausing here to notice something about how this account has been built, since it matters as much as any single piece of evidence within it. Nothing in this account rests on one dramatic discovery or one single compelling story. The width of ancient jaws was established through slow, repeated measurement of skeletal remains across separate, unrelated regions of the world, populations that never had contact with one another, each independently showing the same broad shift once farming took hold, a method resting on nothing more exotic than careful physical measurement, repeated many thousands of times by many different researchers working, in most cases, without any knowledge of what researchers on other continents studying entirely different populations had already found. The biological mechanism connecting mechanical demand to bone growth was established separately through research into how bone tissue in general responds to strain during childhood, a principle understood well beyond the study of jaws alone, tested and confirmed across many different bones and many different species, long before anyone applied it specifically to the question of a shrinking human jaw. The timing of weaning and its shift under farming was read from an entirely different kind of evidence again, chemical traces preserved inside teeth, studied using methods with no direct connection to the archaeology of skeletons or the biomechanics of chewing, methods rooted instead in chemistry, in the way an element like nitrogen moves through a body and settles into growing tissue. The continuation of this same trend into recent history was established through yet another separate method, comparisons between living populations sharing genetic backgrounds, but differing in how heavily processed their food has become, a method resting on modern imaging and modern dental examination rather than on anything buried in the ground at all. 4 largely separate bodies of research, using 4 different kinds of evidence, built by researchers working in different fields who are not necessarily even in conversation with one another, converge on the same underlying picture. This kind of convergence matters more than any single strand on its own, for a reason worth stating plainly. A single line of evidence, however careful, can sometimes be explained away by some overlooked factor specific to the method used to gather it, some quirk of preservation, some bias in how a particular set of remains happened to be selected, some detail about the specific population studied that does not generalize elsewhere. When several independent lines of evidence, built using entirely different tools and entirely different kinds of data, arrive at a broadly consistent answer without having been designed together in advance, the odds that all of them are wrong in exactly the same direction, for exactly the same reason, grow considerably smaller than the odds attached to any one piece of evidence taken alone. A flaw specific to how skeletal measurements are taken would have no reason to also show up in a chemical analysis of nitrogen isotopes inside a tooth. A bias specific to how modern dental researchers select living populations to compare would have no reason to also appear in research studying bone remodeling in a laboratory setting unrelated to any human population at all. A researcher working exclusively with archaeological remains and a researcher working exclusively with living patients in a modern dental clinic would have almost no opportunity to unconsciously influence one another's conclusions, since their work rarely overlaps and their methods share almost nothing in common beyond the underlying question both happen to be circling. This is close to the same reasoning already applied earlier in this account to the three separate, unconnected regions where farming began independently, only here it applies across entire disciplines rather than across separate continents: archaeology, biomechanics, chemical analysis of teeth, and comparative study of living populations, each reaching toward the same conclusion from a different direction entirely, using different assumptions, different instruments, and different sources of possible error that do not overlap with one another in any obvious way. Much as three unrelated farming populations on three unrelated continents shared nothing in common except the outcome, researchers eventually found written into their bones. None of this should be mistaken for uniform certainty across every part of the story told here, and it is worth closing this particular thread by being precise about where that certainty is strongest and where it thins out. The core through line, food that changed with farming, bone that responds to mechanical demand during childhood, jaws that grew narrower as a result, and teeth, including the last molars, left with less room to settle into, rests on the strongest and most consistent evidence in this entire account. Evidence gathered across multiple continents and multiple independent methods over several decades of careful research, examined and challenged repeatedly by researchers with every incentive to find a flaw in it if one existed. The chemical evidence for shifting weaning patterns sits close behind, well supported though somewhat more limited in how many populations have been studied this closely so far. The comparison between traditional and industrialized diets within living populations sits on similarly solid ground, though it covers a much shorter span of time than the deep archaeological record and depends on the specific populations researchers have had the opportunity to study, populations that are not always easy to find or gain access to, since a genuinely close genetic comparison separated mainly by diet is a fairly rare and valuable research opportunity, rather than something available everywhere a researcher might wish to look. The extension of this same idea into the space behind the mouth, the palate, the nasal cavity, and the airway further back remains a genuinely open area of ongoing research, connected to the rest of the story by sound anatomical reasoning, but not yet supported by the same depth or consistency of evidence as the jaw itself. A difference in confidence worth remembering rather than smoothing over for the sake of a tidier ending. Holding both of these at once, the solid core and the more tentative extension, without collapsing one into the other, is the most honest way to carry this account forward into whatever remains to be said about it. What this convergence does not yet do, and what this account has not claimed for it, is answer every question a careful listener might still be holding at this point. Knowing that several independent lines of evidence agree on the broad shape of what happened is different from knowing every detail of exactly how it happened in every population, at every point along the way, or exactly how far its consequences may still be reaching into parts of the body this account has not yet had occasion to mention. A pattern this well supported earns confidence in its general outline, without requiring confidence in every possible extension of it, and the difference between those two things is worth holding on to carefully as this account moves toward whatever remains to be said. What began as a single bite into a tough root on an open plain has, by this point, been traced through bone, through independent continents, through the chemistry of ancient teeth, through the mechanics of a growing jaw, through the crowded space behind a single wisdom tooth, and into a kitchen holding a jar of pureed food, far softer than anything any ancestor ever managed to prepare. Held together, these are not 8 separate stories loosely stitched into one account. They are the same story, read through 8 different instruments, each one independently confirming what the others had already suggested, converging on a single face, an entirely ordinary one, carrying inside it a record of everything that happened since the very first seed was planted on purpose rather than simply found, a record no single instrument on its own would have been enough to fully reveal. There is something worth sitting with in the sheer ordinariness of that face, since nothing about this account has ever depended on finding an unusual person, an unusual skull, or an unusual population. The evidence gathered here describes a pattern general enough to apply, in some degree, to an enormous share of people living today. A pattern written not into any one remarkable individual but into the ordinary architecture of an ordinary mouth, repeated across billions of separate lives without any of those lives needing to know the history sitting quietly behind their own jaw, passed down not through any story told aloud but through bone itself, generation after generation, long before this account ever attempted to put any of it into words. Imagine the entire span of time since the ancestors of modern humans first began walking upright, stretched out as a single long road disappearing into the distance, far too long for any one person to walk in a lifetime. Nearly the whole of that road is empty in a certain sense. Quiet, gradual, each stretch of ground looking almost identical to the stretch before it, changes happening so slowly across it that no single traveller moving along it would ever notice the ground shifting beneath their own 2 feet. A traveller walking this road would pass through countless generations without ever seeing, in their own lifetime, anything resembling the kind of change this account has spent so long describing. The road simply continuing on, mile after mile, in what would look, to anyone standing on it, like an unbroken and essentially permanent landscape. This is, in a real sense, how nearly every part of the human body has behaved across nearly the entire length of the species' existence, changing, but changing so gradually that permanence was, for all practical purposes, indistinguishable from the actual pace of things. Only at the very last, narrowest sliver of that road, so close to its final end that it would barely register as a distinct stretch at all against the length of everything behind it, does something unusual happen. The road itself does not change shape. What changes is the pace at which the traveller is moving, slow and steady for nearly the entire distance, then suddenly, unmistakably, faster, covering in a handful of steps what earlier stretches of the same road would have taken far, far longer to cross. That final sliver is where farming sits, and everything that followed it. Deep transformations to the human body, the kind visible in the skeleton and carried forward across the species as a whole, have historically unfolded across timescales that dwarf anything described so far in this account. Changes to the overall shape of the skull, the gradual expansion of brain volume across the history of the genus that eventually produced modern humans, the slow, incremental adjustments that came with walking upright on 2 legs rather than 4, all of these unfolded across a stretch of time so long that no single generation, or even hundreds of generations strung together, would have noticed much difference between a parent's skeleton and a child's, each shift so small from one generation to the next that it would have been effectively invisible to anyone. Lacking the ability to compare remains separated by many thousands of years side by side. A person born at nearly any point along that vast earlier stretch of the road could have lived an entire life, raised children, grown old, and died, all without their own body differing in any meaningful, visible way from the bodies of their parents or their grandparents, the pace of change simply too slow to register within the span of any single life. These kinds of change typically depend on shifts in which individuals within a population happen to survive and reproduce more successfully than others, a process that requires many generations simply to begin showing up clearly, and many more still to become the new ordinary shape of an entire species. Since a new trait first has to appear, then has to offer some genuine advantage, then has to spread gradually as individuals carrying it out reproduce those who do not. a sequence of steps that takes real time to complete no matter how favourable the trait in question happens to be. The story traced across this account moves at a completely different pace, and understanding why requires being precise about what kind of change has actually been described here. What happened to the human jaw after farming took hold is not, strictly speaking, the same kind of change as the slow reshaping of the skull across the deep history of the genus Homo. It does not appear to rest on certain individuals surviving or reproducing more successfully because they happen to carry a gene for a narrower jaw, the way a genuinely new inherited trait would need to spread through a population across many generations of selection. Instead, it rests on something considerably faster, a single set of genetic instructions present in a human body since long before farming ever began, capable of producing a noticeably different final result depending on the environment that body actually grows up in. This is sometimes called developmental plasticity, the capacity of a growing body to respond to its surrounding conditions and end up shaped differently as a result, without any change at all to the underlying genetic instructions being passed from parent to child. The same basic biological instructions, present in a human infant born 10,000 years ago and a human infant born last year, remain capable of building either a wide jaw or a narrower one, depending almost entirely on the demands placed on that jaw during the specific years it is still growing, rather than on any difference in the genetic code itself. A striking thought, once it is allowed to sit for a moment, that two infants separated by an enormous stretch of time could, in principle, be born carrying essentially the same instructions and yet grow into adults with meaningfully different jaws simply because of what those instructions were asked to respond to. The gene, or the small set of genes, responsible for how a jaw grows has likely remained largely unchanged across this entire account, carried forward essentially intact from the earliest scenes described here through every generation that followed. What changed was the input that gene received, food that demanded less work from a growing mouth, and a body that, using instructions it had carried all along, simply built something different in response. This kind of responsiveness is not unique to the jaw, even if the jaw offers an unusually clear and well-documented example of it. Bone throughout the body retains some capacity, especially during childhood and adolescence, to build itself more densely in response to regular physical load, which is part of why children who grow up active in ways that place real stress on their skeleton often end up with measurably denser bone as adults than children who do not, without either group's underlying genetic instructions for building bone differing in any way. This same general principle, a single set of instructions capable of producing different outcomes depending on the physical demands placed on a growing body, sits at the center of nearly everything this account has described about the jaw, only applied here to bone density across the whole skeleton rather than to the width of a single structure at the front of the face. Skin darkens in response to sun exposure across a single season using instructions present in that skin since birth. Instructions capable of producing a visibly different result depending entirely on the environment a person happens to be living in that year. None of these examples involve any change to which genes a person carries or passes on to their children. Each one involves the same underlying biological instructions producing a different visible outcome because the environment asking those instructions to do their work has changed. The story of the human jaw belongs to this same broad category of biological response, only unfolding across many childhoods and many generations, rather than within a single body over a single season, which is why its effects, though built the same way, accumulate into something visible across an entire population rather than staying confined to any one individual life. This distinction matters enormously for understanding the pace involved. A change that depends on which genes get passed down to the next generation requires waiting for that next generation, and the one after it, and often many more beyond that, before a new pattern becomes visible across an entire population, since natural selection can only work with whatever variation already exists among individuals currently alive, favouring some over others across repeated cycles of birth, survival, and reproduction that cannot be rushed or compressed no matter how strong the underlying pressure driving the change happens to be. A change that depends instead on how an already existing set of instructions responds to a new environment can, in principle, show up within a single generation, exactly as described earlier in this account regarding children born into households that had already shifted towards softer food, since nothing about this kind of change needs to wait for a new gene to spread, only for a new environment to arrive and a body already equipped to respond to it. This is precisely why farming's effect on the jaw could unfold within a handful of thousands of years, considerably faster than most changes of comparable size described earlier in the deep history of the human skull, and why the more recent industrial acceleration of the same trend could unfold within a mere handful of decades, timescales that would be almost unthinkably fast for a change, resting on shifting gene frequencies alone, but that make complete sense once the change is understood as the same old biological machinery simply responding to new instructions written by an entirely new diet. Seen from this distance, the whole of the story told across this account starts to look less like an unusual exception and more like a demonstration of something true about the body more generally, that certain kinds of transformation, the kind that depend on a growing body listening and responding to its environment, rather than on a species slowly reshuffling which genes survive across generations, can move at a pace far closer to a single human lifetime than to the deep evolutionary timescales usually associated with change of this size. This does not make the jaw's transformation any less real, any less physically embedded in the skeleton, or any less deserving of the word change. It simply means the road analogy offered earlier was, in its own way, slightly misleading, since it is not that farming somehow allowed evolution itself to speed up. It is that the change being described here was never quite the same kind of process as the slow reshaping that occupies nearly the entire length of that long road in the first place. A different mechanism entirely, one that had been sitting ready inside the human body the whole time, waiting only for a different set of daily demands to arrive and put it to use. The jaw did not need eons to arrive at its current shape. It needed only a handful of childhoods, repeated widely enough and consistently enough, built on machinery already present in the body long before any of this began, waiting only for a different set of instructions to arrive at the dinner table. Somewhere in the middle of an entirely ordinary day, a hand might rise without any particular reason and rest for a moment against the side of a jaw, feeling for nothing in particular, simply resting there the way a hand sometimes does during a quiet stretch of thought. Underneath that hand sits a structure whose exact width, whose exact capacity to hold every tooth it was ever meant to hold, was decided long before the person doing the resting was born. Decided not by them, not by their parents, not even by anyone who could have named a single ancestor in their own family line, but by a decision made by people who lived and died without ever knowing. That decision would still be shaping a face this many generations later. There is no moment in an ordinary life when this fact announces itself directly. No one is handed, at birth, a note explaining that the exact shape of their jaw traces back to a choice about crops made thousands of years earlier by people whose names no record has preserved. It simply arrives, already built, already settled, indistinguishable in daily experience from anything a person might assume was simply theirs from the very beginning, personal, private, entirely their own. A person might spend an entire lifetime touching their own jaw, in passing moments like this one without ever once connecting that gesture to anything beyond the immediate present, without any reason to suspect that the shape beneath their fingers carries, quietly folded into it, a record stretching back across an almost unimaginable number of ordinary days lived by people who came before them, people who never once thought of themselves as leaving anything behind in a stranger's face so many centuries later. This is a strange kind of inheritance to sit with, stranger in some ways than the more familiar inheritances people tend to think about. The colour of a person's eyes, the shape of a nose passed down through a recognizable family resemblance, inheritances a person can usually trace, at least loosely, to a specific relative whose face carried something similar. Those inheritances feel, in some intuitive sense, like they belong to a person, carried directly from a known parent or grandparent whose face can be pictured or remembered. This one arrived by a completely different route, not through any single relative's face, but through a choice about food, made by people whose names have long since been lost, whose faces no one living today has ever seen or could recognize. It is worth sitting with how wide this particular inheritance actually reaches. since almost nothing else traced across this account has applied quite this broadly, touching people who share no language, no culture, and no recent history in common, connected only by an ancient and largely invisible thread running through the shape of a jaw. Farming, as described earlier, arose independently in more than one part of the world, among populations that never had any contact with one another. This means the general pattern described throughout this account. A jaw shaped by childhood diet, narrowing once that diet grew soft enough for long enough, does not belong to any single ancestry or any single region of the world. It belongs, in some measure, to an enormous share of humanity, touching descendants of farmers from every one of those independent regions, and, more recently, touching populations that never farmed in quite the same way at all but have, within the last century or two, adopted the same heavily processed, softened diet described toward the end of this account. Two people who might otherwise share almost nothing in common, different continents of ancestry, different languages, different histories stretching back in entirely separate directions, could each, independently, be carrying some version of this same narrowing in their own jaw, arrived at through entirely separate historical paths that nonetheless converged on the same underlying biological result. It is an odd kind of connection to draw between two strangers who will never meet, joined by nothing more than a shared vulnerability to the same basic biological process, triggered independently by their own family's own particular history of food, arriving at a broadly similar outcome despite having nothing else in common at all, no shared language, no shared history, no shared culture beyond the deep and largely forgotten fact that some ancestor of each, at some point, chose to grow food rather than only find it. A trait this widespread, yet this invisible to the people carrying it, is unusual. Most things shared this broadly across humanity tend to be either obvious, like the basic shape of a human hand, or explained by something people already know to look for, like ancestry passed down through a recognizable family line. This one sits quietly in between, universal enough to touch nearly everyone, personal enough to feel, when finally noticed, like something belonging only to the mouth doing the noticing. There is something worth naming honestly in this, without turning it into either a complaint or a source of alarm. Nobody living through the earliest shift to farming was making a choice about anyone's jaw. They were making a choice, entirely reasonable at the time, about food security, about surviving a season without enough to eat, about staying in one place long enough to raise children safely rather than moving constantly in search of the next meal. Faced with the same set of circumstances, the same uncertain harvests, the same vulnerable children needing to be fed reliably through difficult seasons, it is difficult to imagine many people making a meaningfully different choice, or even recognizing that a choice about food security carried any connection at all to the eventual width of a great-grandchild's jaw. The jaw was never the point of the decision. It was simply along for the ride, an unintended consequence riding quietly behind a choice made for entirely different, entirely sensible reasons. The same way any large historical shift tends to carry consequences. Its original decision-makers had no way of anticipating or intending. This is not a story about anyone choosing badly. It is a story about how thoroughly the body remains connected to decisions that, on the surface, appear to have nothing to do with the body at all. Decisions about crops, about settlements, about how to store food through a difficult season, reaching all the way down into the width of a jaw and the room available for a single back tooth thousands of years later. Very few decisions made by any generation come with a visible list of everything they will eventually touch, and the width of a distant descendant's jaw would have sat, for the people making this particular decision, so far outside the range of anything they could have been expected to consider that its absence from their thinking reflects nothing about their judgment at all. And yet this account would be incomplete if it ended there, leaving the impression that humans have simply been carried passively along by this process without ever noticing or responding to it. Once dental crowding and impacted teeth became common enough to be a routine part of daily life for a large share of the population, an entire field of practice grew up specifically to address it, and, quote, developing tools and techniques capable of doing something farming itself could never do, correcting the shape of a dental arch, or the position of a crowded tooth within a single human lifetime rather than across the many generations the original biological process required. A person born today with a jaw too narrow to comfortably hold every tooth it eventually needs to accommodate has access, in a great many parts of the world, to intervention capable of addressing that mismatch directly. Wire and gradual pressure applied over months or years, guiding teeth into positions the jaw itself, left alone, would never quite have offered them. Extraction, when a jaw simply does not have room for every tooth regardless of any repositioning attempted, offers another direct response. Removing a tooth rather than forcing an already crowded arch to somehow accommodate it, a solution unavailable to any ancestor living before this kind of care existed, who would have carried whatever crowding resulted from their own childhood diet for the remainder of their life without any means of correcting it, living with pain, misalignment, or infection that today would be addressed as a matter of routine care rather than endured indefinitely. This is a genuinely different kind of timescale than anything else described across this entire account. Not thousands of years, not even the handful of generations described in the more recent parts of this story, but a single childhood or a single adulthood, addressed directly and deliberately rather than left to unfold slowly across bodies not yet born. This response did not undo the underlying history described throughout this account, and it would be a mistake to read modern dental care as somehow reversing anything traced across the many earlier parts of this story. It represents something else entirely, a demonstration that once a slow, unintended biological consequence becomes visible and understood, culture, the same force responsible for the original change through something as simple as a shift in diet, can also be turned deliberately toward correcting it, on a timescale the body alone could never have managed on its own. There is a kind of symmetry worth noticing here, easy to miss without having followed the entire account this closely. The same basic capacity that allowed early farmers to change what an entire population ate, and through that change the shape of an entire population's jaw across generations, is the same basic capacity, applied differently, that now allows a single dentist or orthodontist to change the outcome for a single individual within a matter of months. Both depend, at their core, on the same simple fact traced across this entire account, that a growing or already grown human body responds to the physical forces applied to it, whether those forces arrive as an entire population's daily meals repeated across generations, or as a carefully calibrated wire applied to one specific mouth for a carefully measured stretch of time. Culture caused this. Culture, in its own more recent and more deliberate form, has also begun answering it, though not by reversing the original cause, since the underlying diet has, if anything, continued in the same softening direction described earlier in this account, but by intervening directly on the result instead, addressing the visible consequence one individual mouth at a time, rather than waiting for the original cause to reverse itself, a correction aimed at the symptom rather than at the deep root still quietly sitting several thousand years back along this entire account. Press a tongue once more against the back teeth, the same simple motion offered at the very start of this account, before any of what has since been described was known. Feel again whatever is there to feel, tightness or ease, a tooth sitting flush against its neighbour or a small gap where one settled with room to spare, and notice that this sensation, so easy to overlook on any ordinary day, now arrives carrying an entire history behind it. At the start of this account, that same motion was offered as an open question, a way of grounding an idea not yet explained in something immediate and physical. Returning to it now, everything that idea once gestured toward has been laid out in full, piece by piece, across every part of this account that came before this moment. The distance between that first quiet gesture and this one is, in a very real sense, the entire distance this account has travelled from a simple physical sensation offered without explanation to that same sensation returned to, now carrying the full weight of everything that has since been said about it, a distance measured not in miles or in years but in understanding alone. Nothing about the mouth itself has changed since that first moment at the beginning of this account. What has changed is everything now understood about how it came to be shaped exactly this way, an understanding that does not alter the physical fact sitting there in the jaw but changes, completely, what it means to notice it. Somewhere behind that same spot at the back of the mouth sits the ghost of a tough root pulled from dry ground. The very first image offered in this account, a jaw straining against real resistance meal after meal, across a stretch of time long enough that no single measure of years quite captures it. That resistance built something, patiently, across an entire childhood, widening a structure that would go on to hold every tooth eventually asked to fit inside it, generation after generation, largely unbroken, for the greater part of the human story, long before anyone had a name for farming, a jaw, or a childhood at all, only the daily wordless work of finding and chewing whatever the land happened to offer that particular day. Somewhere behind that same spot sits also a bowl of ground grain, softened over a low fire, the moment everything began to shift. A single change in what counted as an ordinary meal that would, given enough time and enough repetition, reach forward into bone it would never directly touch, a stone worked patiently against another stone, a fire tended carefully enough to turn something hard into something a very young mouth could manage without complaint, the first quiet turn in a road that had, until then, run in essentially one direction for longer than anyone could measure. Somewhere behind it sits three separate, unconnected corners of the world, three unrelated crops, three populations who never once spoke to one another, each independently leaving behind the same quiet signature in the ground for researchers centuries later to find and compare, unaware that their own separate, unremarkable choices about food would eventually be read as three versions of the same single experiment. Somewhere behind it sits a muscle, invisible beneath the skin, pulling gently but insistently against bone still capable of listening and responding. Across years no memory could ever reach back far enough to recall directly, doing its quiet work without any awareness on the part of the child whose jaw was, at that very moment, being decided. Somewhere behind it, closer now, sits a bowl of soft porridge held to a child's mouth by a caregiver whose name has been lost entirely, an ordinary act of feeding that, repeated across generation after generation, quietly compounded into something measurable many centuries later, each caregiver doing nothing more than what seemed, at the time, like the simplest and kindest way to feed a hungry child. Somewhere behind it sits a single tooth, the very last one scheduled to arrive, waiting years beyond every other tooth in the mouth for its own turn, inheriting whatever space happened to be left once every earlier claim on that jaw had already been settled, arriving finally, often in the middle of a person's teenage years, into a mouth it had no say in shaping and no chance to change, a late arrival forced to make do with whatever room a much longer history had already decided to leave it. Somewhere behind it, more tentatively, less certainly than anything else in this account, sits a question still being worked out by researchers about breath itself, about how far this same shift might reach beyond the mouth and into the space every person quietly depends on without ever thinking about it. A thread this account has been careful not to overstate, offered honestly as uncertain rather than dressed up as settled fact, sitting at the very edge of everything this account has been willing to claim with confidence. And somewhere behind it, closest of all, closer than anything else traced across this entire account, sits a kitchen counter under electric light, a jar of food softened almost beyond recognition, the same basic impulse that began with a stone and a low fire, carried forward and intensified far beyond anything early farming ever managed to produce on its own, arriving, in the end, at exactly the mouth doing the noticing right now, the final and most recent link in a chain stretching back further than any single memory could ever reach. Held together, all of it sits inside a single mouth, a single ordinary jaw, closer than any of the separate pieces ever felt while being described one at a time, since a story told in order, one thread at a time, can make even the most personal ending feel distant, an idea encountered rather than a fact actually lived inside, a chart or a timeline rather than a felt, present sensation sitting quietly in a real body right now, returning now to the body itself, to the exact spot where a tongue can still feel whatever there is to feel, collapses that distance completely. Every separate strand traced across this account, the archaeology, the biomechanics, the chemistry of ancient teeth, the demography, the modern comparison, the still uncertain question about breath, arrives in the end not as separate facts scattered across a long account, but as a single, unified physical sensation available right now in this exact moment to nearly anyone listening, wherever they happen to be, however far from any of the places this account has described. None of this needed to be known for any of it to be true. A person could live an entire life never once hearing any part of this account and still carry, in the exact width of their own jaw, in the exact amount of room available to their own last tooth, the full weight of everything just described, unnoticed, unremarked upon, simply present the way the shape of a hand or the colour of an eye is simply present, needing no explanation to exist. Millions of people fall asleep every single night with this exact history sitting quietly in their own mouths, entirely unaware of it, and nothing about their lives is lesser or incomplete for not knowing it, since a body does not require its own history to be understood in order to function, to grow, to carry a person through an entire lifetime exactly as it was built to do. Somewhere among all of those millions, on any given night, a listener to this very account is likely doing exactly that, falling asleep with a jaw shaped by everything just described, the story and the body it describes finally meeting in the same quiet, unremarkable moment. What has changed across the time spent following this particular thread from a tough route on an open plain all the way to a kitchen counter today is not the shape of any single jaw. It is the meaning available to whoever happens to notice that shape, the difference between feeling a small tightness at the back of the mouth and dismissing it as nothing worth a second thought, and feeling that same tightness while understanding, even faintly, that it sits at the very end of one of the longest and quietest threads the human body has ever carried, a thread reaching back further than any single family history, any single nation, any single named civilization, all the way to a decision about food made before any of those things existed at all. There is something worth holding on to in the fact that this thread runs through an entirely ordinary mouth rather than an unusual one, through an entirely ordinary life rather than a remarkable one. Nothing about this account has ever required a listener to be anyone in particular, to trace their ancestry back to any specific region, to belong to any specific population studied by any specific researcher named or unnamed across this entire story. It required only a mouth, built the same way every human mouth has ever been built, responsive across childhood to whatever it was asked to do, carrying forward whatever answer that responsiveness produced into the rest of an adult life, lived largely without a second thought about where any of it actually came from. This is, in its own quiet way, what makes the story worth telling at all, not because it describes something rare or extraordinary happening to a small number of unusual people, but because it describes something true about nearly everyone, an entire species carrying, in the most ordinary part of its most ordinary anatomy, the accumulated trace of a decision made so long ago that the people who made it have no names left for anyone to remember, a decision made about crops and seasons and survival, never once about a jaw, and yet arriving, all these generations later, exactly there. A tongue resting once more against the back teeth, feeling whatever is there to feel, is not searching for anything unusual. It is simply resting, briefly, on the closest and most physical piece of evidence available for a story this long, this quiet, and this thoroughly written into the one part of the body every person carries with them into every single day of their life, whether or not they ever stop to notice it, whether or not they ever learn, as this account has now laid out in full, exactly how it came to be shaped this particular way, a shape decided long before any question was ever asked about it, and carried, without complaint, into this exact quiet moment. Somewhere very close to sleep now, in that quiet stretch where a mind starts to let go of sharp edges and hold on to only the softest outlines of a story, it is worth resting once more on the simplest version of everything just described. A body was built, across an entire childhood, by whatever it was asked to do each day, and one particular childhood, repeated across generation after generation, was asked to do less than the childhood before it, meal after meal, for reasons that had nothing to do with anyone's jaw at all. That is the whole of it, stripped down past archaeology, past chemistry, past every careful caveat offered along the way. a body listening to its own daily life and quietly building itself around whatever that life happened to demand. Nothing more complicated than that needs to be carried forward from here. No list of facts to hold on to, no details requiring effort to remember, only that single, simple picture, a body shaped patiently by its own ordinary days, repeated across more of those days than any single mind could ever hope to count. Somewhere far behind this exact moment, further back than any name or any date this account has offered, a child once bit down on something tough and resistant under an open sky, and somewhere much closer, nearer than any of the history just described, a different child, perhaps the very listener drifting towards sleep right now, once ate something soft from a spoon without a single moment of resistance at all. 2 lives, 2 mouths, 2 entirely different childhoods, joined quietly across an almost unimaginable distance by the same simple biological thread. Both of those moments, separated by an almost unimaginable stretch of time, belong to the exact same story, a story about a body quietly listening to whatever world it happens to be born into and building itself accordingly, patiently, without complaint, without any need for anyone involved to understand what was actually happening. Neither child across that entire stretch of time needed to know anything about bone or muscle or the slow arithmetic of mechanical demand for their own body to carry out its part of the process exactly as it always has. The body doing its quiet work regardless of whether anyone watching understood a single piece of it. There is a kind of comfort available in a story shaped this way, even one describing something as ordinary as a crowded tooth or a jaw slightly narrower than it once tended to be. Nothing in this account points to any failure, any mistake, any choice made carelessly by anyone whose face this shape happens to belong to now. A jaw shaped this way was built by circumstances entirely outside anyone's control, set in motion long before any currently living person's earliest ancestor was born, carried forward by ordinary meals eaten by ordinary people trying, in each case, to do nothing more than feed a child well. Every caregiver in every generation traced across this account, from the earliest farmer softening grain over a low fire to a parent today opening a jar at a kitchen counter, was doing the same simple, loving thing, offering a child the easiest, safest, most reliable food available to them at that particular moment in history, unaware and with no way of being aware of any longer story their choice might quietly be joining. There is no version of this account that assigns blame to any single link in that long chain, no generation singled out as having done something the others did not, since every one of them, faced with the same basic instinct to feed a child gently and safely, would very likely have made some version of the same choice, whatever tools and foods happened to be available to them at the time. It is worth extending that same generosity inward as well, toward one's own jaw, one's own crowded or uncrowded teeth, one's own face carrying whatever particular version of this long history it happens to carry, since nothing about that shape reflects a choice made poorly by anyone, least of all by the person wearing it now, tonight, drifting quietly towards sleep. If there is a lesson worth carrying out of this account and into whatever comes after it, it is not a lesson about what to eat differently tomorrow or what to worry about tonight. Since this account has never been in the business of telling anyone what to do with their own body, it is closer to a lesson about looking at an ordinary feature of an ordinary face and recognizing, underneath it, an entire deep history rather than a flaw, a story rather than a shortcoming, evidence of how faithfully a body does exactly what it was built to do, responding, across childhood, to whatever world it happens to be born into. That kind of recognition extends further than any single jaw. Nearly everything about a human body carries some version of this same quiet responsiveness, some trace of a childhood environment folded into an adult shape, largely invisible unless someone happens to go looking for it the way this account has gone looking for it here. The width of a jaw happened to be the thread followed across this particular account, chosen because the evidence supporting it is unusually clear and unusually well documented, but the underlying principle almost certainly extends into other quiet corners of the body as well. Corners this account has not had occasion to explore tonight, each one shaped, in its own way, by some version of the same conversation between inherited instructions and the specific conditions those instructions happen to meet during childhood. Somewhere in the density of a bone, in the exact curve of a spine, in 100 small details no one has ever thought to trace back this carefully, some version of the same quiet history is very likely sitting, waiting for the right researcher, with the right patience and the right evidence, to notice it the way this particular thread was eventually noticed, sitting there tonight, unremarked upon, in bodies asleep all across the world. A person curious about their own body, wondering why some particular feature turned out the way it did, might find, if they look closely enough and patiently enough, that the honest answer is rarely simple, rarely a single cause acting alone, and almost never anyone's fault, but instead some quiet combination of inherited instructions and the specific, ordinary conditions those instructions happened to meet during the years. A body was still listening and still capable of change, a combination no single person could ever be expected to have controlled or foreseen. This is, perhaps, the most useful thing this account has to offer beyond its specific claims about jaws and teeth. A reminder that a body is not simply handed down unchanged from parent to child, like an heirloom passed along a shelf, but built, actively and continuously, in conversation with the exact world it happens to grow up inside, a conversation no single person controls entirely, and one that began, for every person currently alive, long before they had any say in it at all, and will continue, in some quiet form, for every child not yet born. There is one particular question sitting underneath all of this, the same question this account opened with, though it now looks slightly different than it did at the very beginning. It was asked then as a question about farming and a face, offered before anything had been explained, meant only to place a single, simple sensation, a tongue against a back tooth, alongside a question large enough to fill an entire account. Having followed the entire thread from a tough root on an open plain through bone, through generations, through a single crowded tooth, and into a kitchen counter holding food softer than anything any ancestor ever managed to prepare, that same question opens outward into something considerably larger, something this account is not able to answer, only able to leave sitting quietly in the dark alongside everything else that has been said tonight. Farming reshaped the human face slowly, invisibly, across thousands of years, through nothing more dramatic than what a child happened to eat on an ordinary day, repeated across enough ordinary days and enough ordinary generations to eventually show up in the measurable width of a jaw. That much, this account has laid out as carefully and as honestly as it knows how, checking each claim against the evidence available, holding the more certain parts of the story apart from the more tentative ones, never reaching for a conclusion stronger than what the evidence itself could actually support, even when a stronger, more dramatic conclusion might have made for an easier or more satisfying ending. What it cannot lay out, what no single account could ever fully lay out, is everything else currently unfolding in exactly the same quiet way right now, in homes and kitchens and ordinary days scattered across the entire world, changes too small and too gradual for any person alive today to notice happening. The way no farmer standing beside an early field of grain could have possibly noticed a distant descendant's jaw beginning, almost imperceptibly, to narrow. If a single change in what a population ate could reach this far into the shape of a face, quietly, invisibly, across enough generations, what else right now in the ordinary meals, the ordinary rooms, the ordinary daily rhythms of a life lived by someone not yet born, might already be deciding something about a body that will not become visible for hundreds of years still to come, a shape being built right now by conditions nobody currently alive has any reason to suspect are shaping anything at all? There is no way to answer that question tonight, no evidence yet gathered, no researcher yet able to point to the exact place such a change might be quietly taking shape, and this account will not pretend otherwise simply to offer a tidier ending, since a tidy ending, however comforting it might feel right now, would be its own small betrayal of everything this account has tried to be honest about. Somewhere, in an ordinary room very much like this one, a child is eating an ordinary meal tonight, unaware, the way every generation traced across this account has been unaware, that some small and unremarkable part of what fills that plate might, centuries from now, be quietly written into a face no one currently alive will ever meet. A face that will, on some ordinary future night much like this one, rest a tongue against its own back teeth without ever knowing why it feels exactly the way it does, without ever needing to know, and resting easily regardless.